Hi, thanks everyone for taking some time with me today. My name is Matt Balcer. I'm a senior solutions engineer for SentinelOne here in Canada. And the challenge I'm presented with today, and the challenge I'm going to present to this audience, is the dangerous challenge of the vulnerabilities out there. Certainly when we talk about the financial services industry, a highly targeted industry, an industry that has lots of complexity to it. This dangerous game is almost not more important for any other industry on the planet than the financial services industry. So I'm hoping to shed some light on my thoughts on how to play out the vulnerability game, and maybe have some understanding of how it's working in your world. So, certainly, it's news to probably nobody, although, some very respected information here from Forbes and the Washington Post. Forbes releasing, an article just this March about, how obviously the financial industry is still very heavily targeted, and how, hardware, software, application vulnerabilities are a big part of that. It's it's an industry that needs a lot of tools to work properly. And so hackers will take advantage of that, and they'll take advantage of the chaos we've been living through in, the last 16 to 24 months. And they're going to use that to build their APTs, to strengthen their APTs, and to make their APTs more effective. So these advanced persistent attacks are not going anywhere. They're not the next generation anymore. They are the generation, and certainly the vulnerabilities and the way we get exposed plays a large part in their effectiveness. And we definitely saw that, at the end of, I guess, last year with the sunburst attack. Taking advantage, the Forbes article actually references it, says, we were almost done in by the SolarWinds vulnerability and sunburst attack strain, taking advantage of it. And one of the main agencies that the actual cybercrime group that was now attributed to it, Cozy Bear APT 29, they went after the Treasury, right? I had an earlier conversation today on the morning panel, and we all agreed, if you want to bring a nation to a halt, if you want to bring the world to a halt, there's two main veins to the heart of our existence, and that is finance and health. And if you can, take down the banks and you can take down the hospitals, we would be in deep trouble. So I think the focus needs to be here at almost an exponential level in terms of paying attention to the vulnerabilities and how we're exposed. So how do we get ahead of this? And I think the very first step of this is broadening the understanding of what is a vulnerability. Right. When I say vulnerability to most of the, IT and security analysts and executives and people responsible for, security of financial institutions and financial services, the initial response, the knee-jerk reaction I get when I mention the word vulnerability is, oh, you're talking about software. And yes, certainly that plays a part. And that would be, maybe a main focus. But vulnerabilities comes in all shapes and sizes. There's system vulnerabilities, application vulnerabilities, network vulnerabilities, physical vulnerabilities, which actually had less of an impact, over the last year, because we saw people go to their homes. But actually what that did is it exponentially raised the risk of the other vulnerability that's listed there, the human vulnerability, and the elimination of a perimeter. I remember the interesting conversation 5 years ago is you'd go in and talk to somebody responsible either for infrastructure or IT security, and you'd ask them, okay, define your perimeter. And from 1 year to the next, that changed. It went from, well, it's the four walls of our building and the network within it. And I can put a firewall at the edge of that, or I can put protections and controls at the edge of that, and it will, eliminate a great deal of my risk and exposure. Well, that perimeter is gone. That perimeter changed 5 years ago to, well, now it's the cloud and outside services and infrastructure as a service and applications as a service. Well, now it's the people who have left the building. So it eliminated your perimeter once again, because now I need to worry about not just the vulnerabilities of the applications I'm providing my people, the hardware I'm providing my people, and the network I'm providing my people, but I have to worry about the vulnerabilities in their own environment, in their home office, on their home network. I don't know a lot of executives that are looking at, the vulnerability publications of Samsung TVs or smart fridges or smart coffee makers. Are we paying attention to those? But right now, those might be some of the more important vulnerabilities because they're largely out of our control. I can't force my users to update their TV or update their coffee maker. I only have control of their corporate asset. But now I'm exposed because my perimeter is enlarged. And so when I go down that list, it's just not the OS and the application vulnerabilities I have to be very cognizant of. It's all of these vulnerabilities, because all of them expose me almost equally. And so, this gains infinite importance when we understand how some of these advanced persistent attacks really work. And in almost every case, they involve at some point the exploitation of one or many vulnerabilities of the system, applications, or operating system. So, if we look at this graphic, it starts almost with the human vulnerability. How do they get in the first place? It's either missed exposure or I couldn't even call it a human mistake anymore. It's people doing their jobs and trying to adapt the best way they can. Certainly with what we've seen, over the last, again, 16 months, and I don't mean to harp on the pandemic, but it played a large part in how we need to evolve right now, because, I said it this morning, but the expectation was just security was going to meet whatever changes we needed to make a workforce that maybe was partially mobile, fully mobile, and get everyone out of the building. So it exposed us a great deal more and exposed that human vulnerability more. But then once you get past that, then they gain access to the system and they start to look for different ways to compromise it. Now, hackers are looking for this all day, every day. Their full-time job is to figure out how to compromise your system. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a couple moments about how we actually find out about vulnerabilities, but I'll tell you, they're ahead of us. They're 2 steps ahead in almost every scenario, and that is why they are constantly able to look at and find a vulnerability that allows them to compromise a system, and then once they do that, then they get to the asset, then they find some way to monetize some form of attack on you, because we can never forget that hacking, like it or not, is a profession. It might be an illegal profession, which, believe it or not, comes in second only to the drug trade every year. But other than that, in terms of illegal professions, hacking and cybercrime is number 2 on that list. And so it's something we need to be aware of, and we need to start to find a way to limit our exposure to it, or it's going to continue to lead in a financial way. So the big challenge is there's really 2 types of vulnerabilities, main categories, so to speak. And the 2 main categories are, known vulnerabilities, which means they've been published by hopefully the vendor themselves, making their users aware that a certain software or system has a vulnerability. And hopefully they react quite quickly to that. And they will release patches or adjustments, or in some cases have to completely eliminate a product and recommend that organizations stop using it. But at least there's some awareness there. The more dangerous, in perception at least, is the unknown vulnerabilities. These are ones that are not published by anybody. We typically do not know about them until it's too late. So when we think about how we react, how we detect, how we understand vulnerabilities, the big question is are only the unknown vulnerabilities really dangerous to us? And the known ones are, something that just is part of the world of, operating in a cyber heavy, information tech heavy universe. And, vendors are hopefully very proactive in that way and taking care of them. My answer is typically no. You're not any, more at risk just because most of the vulnerabilities on your systems are known. Because the bigger problem here is, how do we keep ahead? Especially when we're forced to be dynamic. How do we keep ahead of the vulnerabilities that are even being published? I mean, there's a lot of automation available now where, Microsoft and the other OS vendors try and stay as ahead of the game as possible and have created solutions and technology that helps you update and stay ahead of patching. But in the real world, what I've found is that's hyper unrealistic. And it's, our main job as IT workers is typically to keep the lights on, is to allow people to be productive in their day-to-day tasks. That is almost contrary to being ahead of system maintenance. And that's essentially what vulnerability patching is. It's constant system maintenance. And that is, like it or not, halt in productivity, especially in a 24/7 world. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, where you could take a bank system down and take your entire, bank infrastructure down for, 8 hours in the evening and have zero impact on your clientele. That's not realistic anymore. Financial services is a global enterprise with lots of interactions across the globe from one country to another. So it's follow the sun mentality, and everything has to be at our fingertips in a second's notice. And so there's no concept of constant maintenance periods where we can get ahead. So we end up chasing the tail, so to speak, constantly, because it's near impossible to stay ahead, even when these vulnerabilities are published. Now, for the unknown stuff, the approach is completely different. And I'll get back into it, but the approach really there is constantly proactive monitoring of what is going on in your environment, and also being very aware that even some of the most legitimate processes and operations of our systems can potentially be a vulnerability in disguise. So there's a lot of awareness and a lot of proactive work that needs to go into staying ahead of the vulnerabilities we're exposed to. And it comes back to this constant chasing of the tail really comes back to how we actually find out about vulnerabilities. Most of you may already be quite aware of this, but the way most vendors find out about vulnerabilities in their systems or software is through either legitimate crowdsourcing, bug bounties and users who will report, different flaws and or vulnerabilities in the systems, or the more illegal, illegitimate crowdsourcing, which is, the too little, too late story, where hackers will either, take advantage and exploit the vulnerability and create an attack. And then we, the world finds out of it. I mean, in some cases, the vendors have already known. Like if we look at what happened with some of the attacks recently, it wasn't necessarily that the vendors didn't know about the vulnerability. They just didn't necessarily have a way to fix it at a low enough cost to them that they could eliminate the exposure. So these are not the ways we want to be finding out about vulnerabilities. You don't want to be finding out from the bad guys that, there's a flaw in a tool you're using. You want to know ahead of time so that you can be proactive and either patch or remove a risk from your environment. But unfortunately, it's just not the case. Because I'll show you some proof. This is a published list of the applications and or softwares that had the most vulnerabilities both in 2020, so last year, and all time. Anybody, and I wish I was in a live setting where I could watch you guys raise your hands, but was anybody aware of all 807 vulnerabilities that were released last year in Windows 10? I doubt I'd see any hands raised because I'm in the industry and I certainly was not aware of all of them. And, if we look at all time, it's the usual suspects. That's what's scary. We can all say that, banks, healthcare, government, they're doing the best they can to live in a zero risk, zero exposure world. But the truth is, at the crux of most software, most operating, is the core software that your system runs on, the operating system. Look at these lists. It is very system operation heavy, right? Microsoft all over the place. Linux, who we have this idea is, super open source and super safe. The systems cannot be compromised. The reality is they top the list right down to the kernel of the Linux operating system, which has had a near record number of vulnerabilities, both last year and in the past. So if these are the things that we base, our systems on and then run applications on top of, we are heavily exposed. And it comes down to, well, we just cannot rely on these, operating system vendors to constantly be patching ahead of the curve, because it's just not realistic for them. So we have to find a way to do, what I've heard as a new industry term, virtual patching, or at least constant monitoring of our systems for anomalies in their behavior, so that we can identify that something has been exploited, even though it might be legitimate processes and legitimate operations of those systems. We need to have some awareness on them. So, unless you've found a way to completely eliminate Linux and Microsoft from your environment, again, we're back in that tail chasing unless we can find a way to be proactive and monitor these things. So that does bring me back to this subject. So what is passive versus active vulnerability monitoring? I think what most of us are used to when we talk about vulnerability awareness is this passive vulnerability monitoring or scanning, having either some sort of manual process or the automated processes from the vendors where it looks at version and reputation data, and based on that and known vulnerability databases, the CVEs and the NIST lists of the world, they're going to be able to publish those and then use a reputation list to either do some scanning or at least provide you a way to monitor for exploitation of those vulnerabilities. Now, it's pretty easy to identify those based on the reputation because it's just a known list. You're doing a match test to the version of your software, the version of your OS, to these lists. And then based on the CVE data collected and things like that, you can understand the risk and hopefully take action to alleviate the risk and eliminate the potential for exploitation. The problem we get into is when we have to start getting into active monitoring of unknown vulnerabilities, because then you're literally trying to look at thousands, at minimum hundreds of processes and applications and things happening on the endpoint to try and distinguish what is legitimate, what is not, what is behaving normally, what is not. And really, it's a difficult science. It's a difficult game to try and constantly be aware and being able to distinguish between the good and the bad. And then even if we do start to identify something as, oh, here's where I've been exposed, here I see exploitation of something I thought was potentially a legitimate process, service, or application on my system, but then it's understanding, what did that lead to? Because knowing that the vulnerability and the exploitation is there is only one part of the story. Knowing how that vulnerability and exploitation was used is the true story. So that's actually where I don't mean to pick on anyone, but it's actually where I sort of see some of the, security solutions in general fall short. Is they will identify the hammer coming down, but they will not tell you why it came down, what the end goal was, what they were trying to go after, how one thing led to another. And this is an important part of the story, because as we saw in that chain of events I showed you, in an example of a ransomware attack, the vulnerability is somewhere in the middle. They're taking advantage of that at some point, but then you need to understand what the end goal was and how they got there from the vulnerability to the actual malicious action. Again, keeping in mind, hacking is a profession. There's financial motivation. Why are they exploiting that vulnerability? What is their end goal, and why did they specifically choose that vulnerability might also be important. MITRE actually did a great job last year. They annually do sort of an evaluation of security products. Certainly the business we're in EDR, SentinelOne, they did an evaluation of products. And what I actually liked this year is they took a very systematic approach. And what they actually did is they used Carbonac and Fin7, two attack strains very well known in the financial services industry, and showed how some of the EDR solutions out there could actually detect. And what it exposed to me is actually how aware some of these solutions are and how quickly they can shift from providing you potentially some additional information on the known vulnerabilities and maybe a way of patching or virtually patching those vulnerabilities, to that active state of constantly monitoring and providing you visibility to what the vulnerability is, how it took advantage of you, and going back to my last statement, which was, what was the end goal? So when we look at what MITRE did during their simulated attack sequence, you can pinpoint here on the full exposure of this attack several places where a vulnerability was taken advantage of. And this wasn't just the usual suspect of Windows and, Windows just has so many flaws and so many vulnerabilities. No, this was across the board. What was interesting this year is they actually brought Linux into the equation as well with a CentOS bank file server. And we could actually see that using Plink and PSExec scripts, they were actually able to take advantages of vulnerabilities in the CentOS system, as well as, RDP vulnerabilities, Java vulnerabilities, basic registry vulnerabilities inside the Windows system. They were able to take advantage of multiple vulnerabilities to essentially get to that final stage where they executed the VNC persistence. So the problem here was, I kind of needed to catch every step to really understand how to alleviate my possibility of being exploited. Because if I miss one or I miss visibility to one, I may not have fully captured all the places I'm vulnerable. They did the same thing when they looked, the second day where they used more of the Fin7 type attack. But again, access hollowing and privilege escalation and taking advantage of, again, PSExec and other legitimate processes and securities within the Windows system. They were able to go across the system and slowly pick it apart with persistence and precision to get to the end goal. Again, same sort of story. If I miss an element here, I don't fully understand where I was vulnerable and where I need to plug the hole. So visibility and understanding ends up being the most important piece of protecting myself against exploitation. Because if I don't see it and I don't know about it and I don't have context to it, chances are I don't plug the hole and I keep getting hit over and over and over again. There's no secret to the success of the hacking community. It's using the same tried and true methods over and over again, finding the hole, exposing it until someone takes action and removes that hole. But until then, it's greenfield. And no matter what creative name they come up with for their attack, there's a lot of similarities. So when we look at the MITRE results and how certain solutions did, and of course, this is a little self-serving, I don't mind mentioning it, but it takes me back to some of those basic requirements when we're looking at security. Full visibility, seeing each and every step, understanding each place where the hacker took a step and potentially exposed some vulnerability in my environment. And when we look at these results, what is always astonishing to me is so many security solutions are satisfied in catching the end result and missing steps along the way. We were lucky at SentinelOne to a certain extent, but the lucky result was based on phenomenal technology. And what we prided ourselves on is the basic requirement of EDR and security solutions: full visibility. And on top of that, I've mentioned it a couple times, understanding. So one of the other things that MITRE harped on this year is, don't just tell me something happened. Give me context and analytics. So help me understand how and why it happened. And that is also where some of the best solutions out there also, showed their true colors in a high number of analytic connections for each element they detected. The second piece of this, especially when we're living in a world of active monitoring and scanning of vulnerabilities, the big piece here is it's got to be in real time. If I'm reactive has an ugly meaning when we think of it as a non-real-time event. Reactive, if it's in real time, presents something different. It presents agility and an ability to respond even when the unknown comes at you. And so this is really where delays in detection and visibility become a killer. Whatever solution you choose, whatever way you decide your organization needs to actively pursue vulnerabilities, you need that to be in real time. Delays will be a killer. Hackers live on delay, they live on misses. So the more delays you have in providing context and visibility, the more exposed you're leaving the users of your solution. So again, when we look at the detail and the stats that might have produced from this attack sequence, again, the leaders in our industry should be close to that 0 delay mark in providing visibility and detection. The second piece is, one of the challenges I hear almost constantly from, leaders of organizations in the IT security community is it's a people world. Your tool should facilitate my people in doing their job better. The classic analogy of what made Michael Jordan the best basketball player to ever walk the planet. He made every one of his teammates better. If you ask me, and I say this all the time, but my marketing department hates when I say this, EDR and certain security tools may cause more problems than they solve if they are not facilitators, if they do not build in automation, because hackers never give you a second chance. They don't go, hey, you missed this, try again tomorrow. They will take advantage, hit and run, and never appear again. So if things that we're using, especially again, back to this active scenario of pursuing exposure and exploitation, it's got to be in real time. It's got to be hopefully automated in some way, shape, or form. And it's got to facilitate. If it is more chasing of the tail, more configuration change, fatigue, then I'm no further ahead. And so again, when MITRE looked at the challenge and the problem, one of the things that they, quantified was the number of manipulations your solution needed to properly give visibility. And if it needed a lot, then you're probably in trouble. So again, the best of the best solutions will not require a constant chasing of the tail and constant configuration changes to do the job that they're put in place to do. Because at the end of the day, what we are really chasing is resiliency. I can go through and look at vulnerability as one of the aspects, one of the things that we want logs to give us, one of the bits of telemetry we want to pull from systems. But at the end of the day, we've got to identify the IOCs. We've got to identify the affected assets. We've got to identify the tactics, techniques, and procedures used against us. And then most importantly, we've got to identify where we're still at risk. And we've got to identify the path to immunization, identify the path to eliminate the exploitation of our systems. So one piece on that very complex and difficult road. But the more automation and the more a tool can perhaps maybe even step in and give me some of these elements, give me context that lead me to that path of immunization, the better off I'm going to be. Because at the end of the day, we're really trying to climb this pyramid of pain and make it as painless as possible. Because the bottom pieces, the bottom bits of information we get, the classic hash values, the reputation-based attacks aren't that important anymore. The ones that, where I need to look at host artifacts and the telemetry and the activity on the machine to understand what happened, that's where we're seeing a lot of importance. Understanding the patterns where legitimate processes and things that have occurred on a system indicate an attack, not hoping that the reputation has given me all the answers I needed. Because at the end of the day, what this will lead us to, and I'm going to talk about this in another session later today, but just a little bit of a preempt to that is, when I'm talking about this active monitoring and active awareness of vulnerabilities, part of that is hunting them, becoming the hunter, not relying on the known vulnerabilities to give me all the answers, but being able to hunt indications of where something is unknown, but I can recognize that there's an anomaly here based on what I see in the behavior on the machine, or even maybe perhaps the behavior it's pushing a user into. So getting at the top of this pyramid is really important. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's an equal parts people and tool game. So I need to have people who maybe have a basic skill set and can identify this. And I need tools that go beyond reputation and help me hunt and indicate correlation between events so that I have pre-garnered intelligence into what's happening on the system and pre-garnered intelligence into this is anomaly versus this is this legitimate process doing exactly what it's supposed to. So I'm going to jump into a demo of SentinelOne. And my purpose here isn't to sell you our solution, but if you are interested, by all means, we can have a separate conversation. But my purpose here really is to show you an example of what I mean by sort of a active exploitation, exposure, and understanding scenario where I will, look to the root cause and the origin vulnerability of an attack. So that said, what you're looking at here is just trying to get this. What you're looking at here is a standard Windows 10 machine. And actually, as you can see on the desktop, there is a shortcut to a letter of credit that this user is working on. In fact, it's my letter of credit, so hopefully it turns out well. I might have some purchases in the future I'd want to make, and I want to make sure that I can get the proper credit I need to do that. So hopefully this person's going to be able to work on my file and come out with a positive result. I will be showing you the other side to help you understand how the hacker takes advantage of the vulnerabilities here, because we only see one side of it typically. So I'm going to show you the other side, and we'll see how they take advantage. But this is the hacker's system here, and it's using a bunch of different hacking tools, some of which you'll see, some of it which are working in the background. But what you're actually looking at right now is the interpreter session run through Metasploit, and it's sitting in listening mode. So it's just literally waiting for someone to connect and start running my attack sequence. So this user opens up this file, which is the letter of credit sitting in the file store of the bank. And when they open it up, some very unexpected behavior. One, this isn't the letter I received. It looks very different. So obviously not the content expectation that the end user was hoping for. In this case, it's actually asking them to update Microsoft Office. So here's the hacker actually emulating a normal Windows warning that you may need to update one of their elements to a newer version to patch, and this understanding that means, oh, there's probably some security flaws that Microsoft's going to take care of. And so in this case, it's telling them to update, and it's also telling them to enable macros. Well, I can tell you in both cases this is wrong, because the system is on the maybe not the latest, but it's on an up-to-date version of Office, and macros are actually enabled. But I don't know if you also noticed in the bottom right-hand corner, SentinelOne has already started to collect the data of what it's seeing. So we'll see how this continues to play out. But if I go back to the hacker system, you can actually see that as soon as this file was touched, it generated a connection to the machine. So now the hacker is going to play off the expected behavior of both the security that might have been deployed on this system and the user's behavior. So the user might think that the message they're getting in this world file is wrong. They might close it and delete the shortcut and maybe see if there's something wrong with the origin file on the file share. Otherwise, maybe there's an antivirus on here that detected this file. We can actually see that Defender and none of the other antiviruses actually did detect this, but we could hope. If they did detect it, the normal behavior would probably be to eliminate the file, right? That is how traditional endpoint protection has always worked. It detects something based on reputation and eliminates the file. Doesn't work well on fileless, and we'll see how well it works in this scenario. So as you can see, the hacker has just shifted. They're no longer even using Word or the Word file. So let's assume that there was some form of antivirus on the system. I'll close the file and I'll actually do the work of the antivirus. I'm going to delete this file altogether. So I no longer have the shortcut. I've closed Word. All intents and purposes, we could assume that the attack is over. That would be a false assumption. The hacker is now fully connected to the system, and here's where the exploitation comes in. I don't know if you guys are seeing the typeface here, but feature on demand helper, legitimate Windows process. It is actually what allows some applications to garner extended privileges on the system. It's built to do that. Now, the fatal flaw here is if I exploit that, then I can start to manipulate the Windows security features that keep me from gaining control, gaining privilege, etc. And you can actually see here what's happened is the hackers gained the connection to the system. They've done some modifications. So there's some manipulation of some flaws in the registry. There's manipulation of the feature on demand helper, as I said. And basically, it allows them to bypass the user account controls built into Microsoft. Once they get there, the next challenge presents itself, which is, okay, I've gained access, but this organization was smart. They're in a lockdown mode. So they protected all the folders, and all of the users are not admins on their machine. How does the hacker get around that? More vulnerability exploitation. In fact, I use pretty much some of the same vulnerabilities with feature on demand helper and consent to elevate the privileges to a full in-memory admin. Using this reflection and escalation technique, I'm able to elevate the actual user that's logged in to the system, I'm actually able to elevate their privileges. So now I've hijacked this user and they're now a super user on their system. They just don't know it yet. And by the time they figure it out, I promise you, it'll be too little too late. So got full control of the system. It's completely compromised. And I've used that extended exploitation to create a couple connections, persistent connections to this system that will allow me to, make sure that there's no breaks in my attack. And in fact, what we saw was Sunburst, Hafnium, a lot of the big attacks, some of those APT29 attacks that I mentioned earlier on. One of the big keys here is once I exploit the machine, gain persistence. Make sure that even if you have a great security solution in place, a very strong firewall, overwhelm it with the number of connections. I have seen an attack that created over 10,000 connections per system. Let's say we're talking about hundreds or thousands of systems, and even the best firewall in the world starts to detect those. You're going to be able to cut off 10,000 connections at a time? Probably not. Persistence plays a big role post-exploitation. So now that I've exploited the machine, I can start to take advantage. In fact, the main goal of this attack is going to be a new form of ransomware, or, maybe not even ransomware, maybe just complete theft here. What I'm actually going to do, and I'm going to use a rather benign example here, but I'm going to show you how, now that I've gained access to the machine, how quickly I can turn it into the monetization of my attack. So I'll reduce this, and just to show you, I have a folder here, and I've purposely tongue-in-cheek called it a sensitive folder. Now, this could be a database. It could be a client database in a financial world. It could be, more of those credit letters and containing PII and all kinds of documents that might play a role here and be very sensitive data and very compromising data. So I've got this folder. Now, watch what happens as the attack continues. You're going to start to see that data transfer from that Windows system to this hacker system. And actually, I can show you live, prove to you guys that I'm not pulling any tricks. I've actually now got a sensitive folder on my Linux box here, and it just got populated with the files from the Windows machine. So unfortunately, it is literally that easy to compromise the machine, bypass all the securities, use the vulnerabilities, exploit the OS, and then get to my malicious means. Now, what do I do with this? If hacking is my profession, which I promise you it's not, I am a permanent blue and purple teamer. But if this was my profession, stealing the data is not enough. It might be enough if the data I've just stolen has, value on a criminal market. But in this case, not too sure, some sales documents from SentinelOne have tremendous value on the criminal market. So then I have option 2 at my disposal, which is to delete the data at source and force the victim to be victimized a second time by paying to get their own data back. So just gonna take that last shot. When we return to the Windows system, all the folders are empty. I've deleted and wiped the machine clean. So, great story, unfortunate situation. Not sure how we're going to get this user their data back. We'll potentially come back to that. But as soon as I get that call as the IT security worker, how do I figure out how this all happened? How do I figure out where I'm exposed? How do I figure out that path to immunization? How do I eliminate the vulnerability that caused me exposure? Or at least have some awareness of it so I can, increase my active monitoring of it and make sure that I'm limiting my victim spread. So I'm going to click on the alert that's just appeared here. Now, there's lots of data we present to you in terms of an EDR solution, but specific to the vulnerability checks, there's the correlation to different indicators here that will tell me some of the story of how I was exposed, what vulnerability was used, and how they used it. So if I look on the right side of the screen here, you can see that there's certain references actually back to MITRE. So for those of you that aren't necessarily maybe using MITRE as a resource or some sort of MITRE-like intelligence, or, you know, I call them like the Wikipedias of cyber information, you know, where you're going to learn about campaigns, how they're working, and vulnerabilities that are exposed. You know, when I see this information and the correlation back to that resource, this is important because I can see, okay, user account control was bypassed. There's an exploitation there. Normal document behaving abnormally. Was Word, is there a vulnerability in Word that potentially, you know, needs to be taken care of? And in this case, it might just be disallowing the use of macros, right? I see injection into processes. That's a big one, right? That's where I see the privilege escalation, the defense evasion. This is where the hacker is showing me that they are injecting themselves into legitimate processes. If you see that somebody is injecting themselves into your legitimate processes, that tells me that there's a vulnerability that's being taken advantage of in that potentially legitimate process. So how do I figure out what that is? Well, if I don't have, you know, a solution that provides me some of that information, it's not that it's impossible, but then you end up looking for the needle in the stack of needles, as I think someone put it this morning. And that becomes very difficult. If my only resource is extended Windows logs and things like that, I better be really, really good at my job of threat hunting and vulnerability understanding to identify where something may have gone wrong. In this case, I kind of got a cheat code. And the cheat code in this case, yes, is technology. Of course, I'm using our solution, but this could be another set of technology. I could selfishly say that maybe there would be more or less complexity, more or less user-friendly, but everybody's got to figure out where their sweet spot is. But at the end of the day, a computer can do a lot more crunching of data than any human being could ever. So I need to use that technology resource to help me build the case, understand. And in this case, I'm getting the entire kill chain. So I see, okay, something happened in Word, but it went away from Word, created its own temp process. Then I see it's running Who Am I? And it's feature on demand helper. So even if I had not seen what happened from the hacker side, where it was very evident that I was using feature on demand helper as my my point of entry, here as the analyst, I get that information. Oh, feature on demand helper, accessing consent. Oh, and then they could access PowerShell and start running elevated commands. I didn't need to see the hacker's side of the story to understand this now. The technology has led me to my vulnerability and the beginning of my exposure, right? Completing the context in the story, going from unknown, now it's known, but that doesn't end the story for me, PowerShell and the other processes that led to it. Now, some of the best technologies in the world will provide you additional context. What MITRE said is the completion of the antithesis of the problem. So here I see, oh, files were manipulated. There was a network connection made. Processes were spawned. Injection into the memory. So some of this is really important information, like the destination IP address that this machine is now connecting to. That's probably the hacker's resource. Now, maybe not able to drive attribution from here, because if the hacker's good at what they do, they're hiding behind multiple jumps and dark sites, but at least I have some understanding of, you know, what I might want to block, that path to immunization. This connection isn't in and of itself exploitation and a vulnerability. The fact that the system is connected there and that I haven't blocked that IP address is something that is potentially exposing me right now. So I want to quickly take this information and block it. But the bigger question to me is, if the hacker did this to one of my machines, now that I understand where that vulnerability is, it's within the legitimate Windows operating system using feature on demand helper. How do I find out if any other machines have been exposed? Well, again, where technology can play a very good role. We actually have something called storyline technology, which does a lot of the work for you. I don't have to start connecting dots, picking up cookie crumbs and all of that, those analogies. But in this case, the story is put together for me. So again, I can go back and look at this kill chain and pick out that one vulnerability, that one element where feature on demand helper was used, and actually hunt across my entire environment, actively begin to monitor the use of feature on demand helper so that if something does come up, I'm not exposed. So I can look at the processes here. I can find the feature on demand process and search across my environment to see if any others have, exposed me to it. So I'm just going to bring back up this. This kill chain, and we'll be able to pick off one of the processes. It's just loading up the telemetry here, but the crux of the story is being able to connect the dots from one element to another when you look at processes and cross processes to understand, hey, has that same vulnerability be accessed? And then the proactive approach here is be able to create a rule that leads you back to being alerted when even a legitimate process accesses this same story, or the same story starts to produce itself. So having a tool that can take this entire story, identify it as where something went wrong or you were exploited, and create a rule that alerts you when similar behavior starts to produce itself again. So we found the vulnerability. Hopefully, I believe this one was eventually patched by Microsoft, but the feature on demand was taken down here. But I'm still in a scenario where, although I'm on my path to immunization, I still have a user that's in a bit of a trouble. So here's where I'm going to apply the ultimate cheat code, which is some unique SentinelOne technology. I'm actually going to roll this machine back to its pre-attack state using our automated incident response technology, our remediate and rollback. So I'm going to apply this. We'll go back to the Windows machine and we'll see this thing go right back to normal. You'll see the files come back into the folder. More important than that is I don't want to be exploited. I don't want to be compromised anymore. Look what happened to the hacker. It actually killed their C2 server. So, they're no longer in control. They're no longer the ones driving the dialogue here. I'm in control. I've cut them off at the pass, and if they are good at their profession, they're probably going to move on to another target because no point in, they don't want to be the ones chasing the tail, so to speak. So with that said, I believe there might be some questions that have come along the way, and I'll open it up and see if I can answer some of this. Yeah. So one of the first questions was, does all of this information that I just talked about, does this mean that we need to go beyond the standard education, cyber education that we provide our end users, and that, cyber education is a big part, and in a layered approach, it's definitely important. Because we might be chasing a little bit on the vulnerability side of this, having your users aware and able to identify when something doesn't feel right does play an important role. but we need to go beyond that. I would actually say, it's a combination of both training the security assets you have, also your security analysts and your security team, making sure that they have a skill set that is now more of an active skill set, more of a hunter's skill set, is important. And then, just that awareness and having a tool in place that could potentially give you an upper hand or at least some assistance. So another question here, pretty interesting, is how do we establish trust in a reporting community? Looking back at potentially the sources of the vulnerabilities that we see, how do we trust? When I said that probably more than 50% of the vulnerabilities discovered are discovered by the hacking community. So I think, for known stuff, go to the right resources. The right resources tend to be a little more obvious. Security organizations that are publishing this stuff, like NIST and all the things that surround NIST and those types of research engines. I mentioned MITRE a lot during the presentation. They're another great resource. But it's certainly don't trust me. Don't trust your friendly advocate down the street. Look to published resources. They typically do sort of the fact checking for you, and that ends up being a good source, because I guess at the end of the day, the most legitimate source might end up being the vendors themselves, but by that point it's either too late or there's some self-servingness to it. So got to be careful there. Another question, and this comes back to that crowdsourcing. Do I think it's everybody's responsibility to disclose breaches from the institution themselves, or even the other parties that sometimes get involved, incident responders, security vendors, security services companies? I really think that it's everyone's responsibility to create as much awareness as possible. If we look at Sunburst as a great example of this, the victims of Sunburst, I give them a lot of credit. It took a lot, especially for a security company that was a victim, to come out and provide all the data possible. It was the only way we got ahead of it. Otherwise, I think we'd still be seeing a lot of organizations suffer from this. This was a very legitimate software, SolarWinds, and a lot of big and small organizations utilizing it, a lot of people in the financial industry using it. And if we hadn't exposed that breach, we'd still be playing a lot of cat and mouse. So I definitely think some disclosure when possible is the best. And actually, I give credit, when I see some of the banks that have released some of their breaches, if they can talk about it, I think everybody should. So at the end of the day, our main job in any business we're in is protecting the client and the globe at large. So community plays an important part of that. What controls? Yeah, so I think there's a question here sort of about the people process aspect, which, I think is equal and or greater, in the equation than technology. But, should we be putting in plans of action, and what to do when there is a threat, what to do when there is a vulnerability? And absolutely. Plan before, react later. And it limits, when I said that reactive doesn't have to be a bad word. Reactive when you have a plan is a good thing. Reactive when you have no plan is not a good thing, because it typically means you were caught flat-footed and now you're putting band-aids on everything instead of actually solving the problem. So I definitely think full disclosure and having a plan in place will only help. And in terms of, there's also an element here of chain of command, and I think that needs to absolutely start at the top. One of the biggest challenges I saw over the last 24 months was Again, security was the expectation, not the plan. It was, we're going to be agile here. We're going to send everybody home. We're going to hope that they can get on laptops and remote access and cloud access, cloud controlled access, remote controlled access, and all of these things. And the assumption was, as long as we can get productivity back, security should just be there and it should just adapt to whatever we decide to do. That only works for so long. You have to have a plan in advance and make sure that it works. Yeah, so another question here, sort of about the identification of assets. I do believe that the identification of your most important assets plays a big role in scanning and monitoring for vulnerabilities and attacks and threats, because, you know, with limited resources, limited skill sets, you know, and maybe an if and or type scenario when you're choosing what you protect most, being able to understand what the attackers are going to go after. And that's why that second part of the story is so important. Okay, I identified the vulnerability. I identified how they exploited it. What were they after and why were they after it? So identifying those critical assets is all a part of the posture. It's all a part of the approach to making the unknown known and giving yourself that running head start. And with that, I think we're right up on time, maybe went a minute over. So again, I just want to thank everyone for their time and attention today. Hopefully I sparked some conversation. I sparked some thoughts. Don't expect to have all the answers, but hopefully I just continued this dialogue that is just so important around protecting our planet from cyber warfare and cyber criminality. Thanks so much, and look forward to talking to most of you soon. Thanks.